All right, welcome, good morning. How was yesterday for everybody? Was it good? It was awesome. I had a great day. My Crocs served me well. I have a few logistic housekeeping things, so I'm going to kind of get going on that as folks trickle in. Thank you for being here. Actually, everyone clap because you all got here at 8:30. You did your job. Especially, raise your hand if you were here for the storytelling night last night. All right. You got the memo last night, but it was a late night. We had such an amazing time. I hope if you didn't make it, we will have it as part of our conference, I think, from here on out. So when we have our next conference, we're going to do it again. It was so special. We are going to do the book draw for Mariana Chilton's book after, gotcha. We're going to do it after the panel, right before we break for the third workshop session. I don't want to stand up here and call out numbers where people are still in the hallway or not here. So we're going to increase chances of people saying yes. Evaluations. So for the third workshop that y'all are in, we put in the full evaluations for the entire conference in there. So we ask that you fill those out. When you fill out any evaluation for us, it helps us tell the story so that we can keep having these conferences and keep gathering and supporting y'all. So please fill those out today, and there will be buckets, boxes, whatever, for you to put them in. And same with the lanyards and programs. If you want to recycle or provide those programs back to us and the lanyards, we would appreciate it. So there'll be another spot for that as well at the front. And I think that's it for now. So we have an amazing lineup of speakers today, and I'm really proud that we extended our workshop sessions because it was so hard for us to choose. We got so many amazing submissions. So, be engaged, show up. These folks are so excited to share their stories with you and their good news, so please go. All right, I am so happy to welcome Dr. Rebecca de Souza to the stage here this morning. She is an associate professor at San Diego State University and author of the critically acclaimed Feeding the Other, which examines how stigma becomes embedded in the lives of food insecure individuals in the US. Her book won the 2021 Outstanding Book Award from the International Communication Association and the 2020 Outstanding Monograph Award from the National Communication Association. Her research is concerned with how political and economic systems impact access to food, health, and social well-being. And overall, she's just an amazing, wonderful person I've been lucky to get to know. So please welcome Dr. Rebecca de Souza.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. And thank you for being here today, bright and early at 8:30. That was tough for me too, but I appreciate you all being here today. I also want to thank Ms. Justine Post and the Come to the Table team, the tech team as well, and everybody who's made this happen. Today, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about charity, hunger, and the nonprofit industrial complex, and it will take about 30 minutes. After which we have a really exciting roundtable planned with 3 women who are doing some really important work in the food justice world, and we'll meet them in a little bit. So the title of my talk, as I said, is Charity, Hunger, and the Nonprofit Industrial Complex. But the first thing I want to say is thank you. Thank you to all of you who do the work that you do. You are the people who show up, even at 8:30 in the morning. You do the work that AI cannot do and that TikTok influencers will not do. You witness hunger, poverty, and the bureaucratic madness up close. You carry the weight of human suffering every day, and so nothing I say here today is a critique of your care, your ethics, or your labor. In my research, people who work at food pantries and nonprofits are some of the most committed people I know. Most are grounded in this work because of this pan-religious and ethical belief that feeding the hungry is a way of serving God or serving the community, or both. Many enter the space of food assistance because hunger has touched their own lives. Like when I asked Maya, a food pantry staffer, why she does this work, she said, "Because I know on a very small scale what it's like to struggle and live paycheck to paycheck. My parents lived through famine and war, and one of their prides was that I never went hungry. And I realize there are people out there who have lived lives like my parents, and it breaks my heart." So the case I want to make today is not against people like Maya. It's about something much larger, the political and economic system that organizes, contains, and sometimes weaponizes our care. This is the painful paradox at the heart of food charity. The very system that makes your work possible, the funding, the nonprofit status, the donor metrics and partnerships, can also limit what you say, what you can demand, and what we can all imagine together. So drawing on over a decade of research on food assistance in the United States, I argue that systemic charity often works to absorb individual compassion and depoliticizes the conditions that cause hunger. So specifically today, I want to focus on 3 interlocking mechanisms or movements that undermine genuine care: the nonprofit industrial complex, neoliberalism, and stigmatizing communicative discourses. And if you were at my workshop yesterday, you got an earful about some of this as well. All right, so first off, what is the nonprofit industrial complex? So I've been deeply influenced by this book. It's called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded by Insight. Insight is an organization of women of color against violence, and it was founded in 2000 to organize women against interpersonal and state violence. And they learned the phrase, "the revolution will not be funded," the hard way. Sorry, I forgot to... They were initially funded by the Ford Foundation, but in 2000, Insight lost this funding after publicly supporting Palestinian liberation, a thing we are still familiar with 20 years later. They realized at this moment just how quickly funding can disappear when movements challenge dominant political and economic interests. So, from this experience, Insight developed the concept of the nonprofit industrial complex, or the NPIC. Similar to the military and the prison industrial complexes, which you're probably familiar with, the nonprofit industrial complex is seen as a network of relationships among nonprofits, foundations, corporations, and the state, including its criminal justice arm, that manages social problems without addressing structural causes. And the argument is not that nonprofits don't help. It's that the nonprofit system often redirects radical energy into safer, fundable, governable forms. And if this feels abstract, let me make this really concrete. It appears in your funding restrictions that sort people into deserving and undeserving category. It's the separation of activism from service and the pressure to remain politically neutral. It shows up when demands are dismissed as too political or outside the mission. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this. And why is this? It's because from the very beginning, organized charity never existed outside capitalism. It was one of its safety valves. Before the Civil War, most charity in the United States happened informally, through individuals, churches, and mutual aid organizations rather than large organizations. This was people coming together to help one another. This informal kind of charity began to change during the industrial era and industrialization. This was a period of rapid wealth accumulation for some and poverty for others. It was in this moment that organized charities and philanthropic organizations emerged. These institutions were created by economic elites, not only to relieve suffering, but to manage the fallout of industrialization. and to protect their own wealth into the future. In fact, many of the earliest foundations were established by industrialists and robber barons as a way to protect their vast private fortunes across generations. These same foundations still exist today, and alongside the state, they fund much of the nonprofit work we do. And this history matters because it reminds us that the nonprofit sector did not emerge outside of capitalism, but within it, and often with the primary goal of stabilizing it. And this is why organized charity and philanthropy has long operated in tension with social justice movements. Foundations like the Ford and Rockefeller have been implicated in labor repression, political surveillance in the United States, to population control and regime change abroad. This pattern of the NPIC is consistent. Individual suffering may be alleviated, but movements that challenge inequality are dangerous. This tension can be seen most clearly in the historic example of the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party was a revolutionary Black political organization. It was founded by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton in 1966 to combat police brutality and systemic racism against Black communities in the United States. The Black Panther Party combined armed self-defense with community-based programs, such as free breakfast for children and health clinics. They ran these programs while also advocating for Black liberation, economic justice, and an end to state violence. I often use the example of Panthers to talk about food justice because they understood something really crucial. Food is power. And they started the free breakfast program to ensure, as they write over here in one of their op-eds, that the malady of hunger would not keep our children down any longer. And I know it's hard to read, but if you sort of study their materials, nowhere do you see the word charity being used. There's something really powerful about saying that this is the people's free food program, the people's program. These programs, they call them survival programs, not charity programs. And what you do see them doing consistently is offer a clear political analysis of the cause of the problem. And over here, they write, hunger is one of the means of oppression, and it must be halted. Power to the people. In this one, you see a blatant, unapologetic critique of capitalism, where they argue that capitalism is really the cause of oppression in our society. And so overall, you see that the free breakfast program was not charity. It was a deeply political practice that strengthened communities and built collective consciousness. Many of you are perhaps familiar with the work of the Black Panther Party because Winston-Salem was home to the second largest Black Panther chapter, established in 1969. Their survival programs included free breakfast, registering people to vote, an ambulance service, and health screenings. And this is precisely why the Black Panther Party, including in Winston-Salem, became a target of the US state. The state, working with philanthropic interests, moved to repress Panther survival programs. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover identified the free breakfast program as especially dangerous because feeding children built loyalty within Black communities and legitimacy across racial lines. In fact, feeding people was seen as more threatening than armed resistance. So the FBI actively sabotaged the program by undermining donations, spreading rumors of poisoned food, and raiding breakfast sites while children were eating. Over time, the Panthers program was not only dismantled, but co-opted and depoliticized. It was absorbed into state policy through federally supported school breakfast and lunch programs. Yes, indeed, the National School Lunch Program, which we have today, was born out of the Black Panther Party's free breakfast program. However, yes. And it's interesting how even that history is erased and folks are not given credit for it. It took a lot of work to get to that point. So even though the free breakfast program has become part of national policy, what we do notice is that its radical political vision has been stripped away. Today we have the free breakfast and lunch programs in school, but while the food stayed, the politics were dismantled. In many states, these programs are administered with stigma and shame. There are eligibility markers and criteria, separate lines, and even the heavily documented practice of lunch shaming kids and families. And we also have to wonder about what the Panthers would have thought about the quality of food being served to our children. So this is a very concrete example of how radical food politics, a politics that strives for access to basic needs, are neutralized and co-opted into forms that are safer for capitalism but unsafe for people. And now this is a really important point as well. Even as the government clamped down on movements like the Black Panther Party, philanthropic funding from foundations like Ford and Rockefeller flowed into the policing and criminal legal reform structures through institutes such as the National Policing Institute. So private foundations are funding the work that we do, and they're also funding the criminal justice system. Private foundations have always played a role in social welfare, while also playing a role in the punitive and carceral hand of the state to punish those who resist dominant forces. Again and again, the NPIC has drawn a clear boundary. Individual hardship may be alleviated, but collective organizing that challenges capitalism, racism, or state power is a threat. And what this does is it makes the world safer for capitalism and less safe for everyday people like you and me. So that's the nonprofit industrial complex. I'm quickly going to sort of talk a little bit about neoliberalism as well, because this is something we should all know about since this is the environment in which we're swimming. So neoliberalism is also called capitalism on speed. And the nonprofit industrial complex flourishes within a neoliberal environment because neoliberalism shifts responsibility from the government to the private and nonprofit and philanthropic sector. So what is neoliberalism briefly? It's a political and economic theory. Since the 1970s, it's been the dominant way in which we organize politics and society. And it basically says that the government is not responsible for us or the public good, but markets are responsible. And then the role of the government is not to sort of help, to produce public good in society, but it's to ensure free markets and trade. So neoliberalism then shifts responsibility for problems like hunger away from governments onto individuals and charities. Instead of seeing hunger as a public responsibility, it becomes something families, churches, volunteers, and nonprofits are expected to manage. And so this is why the growth of food pantries in the 1980s and 90s and food banks happened alongside the entrenchment of neoliberalism as policy. While neoliberalism is often seen as reducing the size of government, right? A hallmark of conservative ideology, small government. In practice, it actually means increasing government and increasing governance of ordinary people and the poor. In fact, neoliberal scholars argue that we must see neoliberalism as containing two movements, the rollback and the rollout. The rollback refers to the dismantling of public provisions, welfare cuts, erosion of cash benefits, healthcare, food entitlements, while rollout refers to the expansion of programs that monitor, surveil, discipline, and punish those harmed by the rollback. In fact, some say that we're no longer simply in a neoliberal era. We're in a phase of revenge neoliberalism. That's the term. There's also another fancy term you can use, revanchist neoliberalism. That's French for revenge. You can call it the politics of revenge or revenge neoliberalism. We had the Welfare Reform Act in 1996, which brought deep cuts to social services, but now we're in a different phase. This is neoliberalism without apology. It's not just capitalism on speed or capitalism without guardrails. It's capitalism with aggression. It's not just about market efficiency or small government rhetoric anymore. It's a deliberate, punitive project, doubling down on market supremacy, deregulation, and tax cuts while demonizing the poor and aggressively rolling back social protections. In fact, the neoliberal revenge state has been called the centaur state. It's liberal and generous in the top to the Epstein elites, and punitive and disciplinary at the bottom. It's a human and refined face at the top, extending grace and generosity to elites, but it's a horse below, kicking, trampling, and trotting upon the poor. Revenge neoliberalism is not just about social cuts to food and other social services. It's about demonizing and criminalizing the poor, right? The obsession with fraud and abuse. We're talking about the criminals who are taking advantage of the welfare system. That's all part of revenge neoliberalism. It's not just about putting up no camping signs, as we see, a lot of them in California, to move unhoused people along. It's about installing spikes on ledges and barriers on park benches. It's designing these public spaces in ways that actively prevent people from just resting. This revenge is also true of HR 1, the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, and I'm sure you're all learning about that and how to deal with that. But by removing exemptions from people experiencing homelessness, it intensifies the punishment. In fact, I would argue that HR 1 operates as a white nationalist revenge campaign. And we have to name these things, right, very clearly and explicitly. It's a white nationalist revenge campaign, one that strips access to food from refugees, asylees, parolees, many of whom have been displaced by US wars, geopolitical interventions, and state-sanctioned violence against its own people. So this is what a punitive revanchist, revenge political logic looks like. It's not merely the withdrawal of support, but it's the intentional hardening of everyday life against the most vulnerable. And of course, this vengeful political program will feel familiar to many of you. It's why social programs and food assistance are so deeply entangled with paperwork, eligibility rules, work requirements, suspicion, and moral judgment. As one food pantry client described it, I understand there should be some hoops to jump through, but it's endless. It seems like it's never done. And another says, this bureaucracy and administrative burden is not, another client says, this is my full-time job. It's what I do for a living. I just fill out forms and I try to get questions answered, and I'm still confused, and I just sit and cry. So this bureaucracy and administrative burden is not accidental. And I hope you all know that, right? It's the system working as it was designed to take revenge on the poor and other minorities who do not fit into the folds of wealth and whiteness. And lastly, I want to talk about stigmatizing discourses. Because I'm a communication scholar, people often ask me, so what does all of this have to do with communication? And they usually imagine that I'm making flyers and marketing materials or things like that. And some of us do that, but that's not where communication matters the most over here. Communication is central because it's what holds the processes of rollback and rollout together. It's what sustains revenge neoliberalism. These vengeful policies and practices require powerful moral narratives about blame, responsibility, deservingness, and criminality to have staying power. These stigmatizing narratives circulate through everyday stories and dog whistles. We see this amplified in Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric, where migrants are framed as threats and criminals. This framing then legitimizes the abandonment of the state. It makes denying food and care to some groups of people, homeless, prisoners, parolees, migrants, seem appropriate, fair, and legitimate. And across history, right, and even today, systems of domination have depended on powerful stories to justify harm. Slavery, settler colonialism, other colonial projects were defended through moral narratives that framed violence as righteous, civilizing, and necessary. This pattern is an old pattern, and it's not disappeared today. Versions of it persist as older logics of domination adapt to new political and economic forms. Revenge neoliberalism is one of these forms, and it also relies on similar legitimizing stories. And here's the core narrative. It can sort of be summed down in like 4 bullet points. Poverty is a personal moral failure. People are lazy, fraudulent, and criminal. Racial and ethnic minorities and immigrants are morally suspect and criminal. And therefore, surveillance and law and order responses are justified because of moral failure. That's it. This is the core narrative, the core stigmatizing assumptions that are fueling and supporting and legitimizing this entire system. These narratives are not relics of the past. They continue to circulate today in food pantry spaces. So in my book, Feeding the Other, and thank you to many of you who have read the book, and also at the workshop yesterday, we talked about the common stereotypes that surface in food pantry spaces, like the family structure stereotype, the fancy car stereotype, the racist, ethnic, anti-immigrant stereotype, the morally unworthy stereotype, the ungrateful client stereotype, the structural stigma. And these narratives tell us that the ideological work of neoliberalism is kept alive through everyday interactions in our workplaces. Neoliberalism is a policy text and exists out there, but it's also enacted in everyday spaces. We enact policy in everyday spaces. And they proliferate in online spaces as well. It's incredible if you just type in some of these words, fancy car, into your Facebook, it will pull up thousands of people articulating the same narrative about the fancy cars at food pantries and why don't they have access to fancy cars. And I just pulled up 2 of them. This stigma, importantly, is also internalized by people experiencing hunger and poverty. People describe shame, self-blame, and silence. They withdraw from civic life and are made to feel guilty about securing their rights. One woman I interviewed described picking up extra food for her family and feeling judged. And she said, people give you looks, and you start thinking, damn, am I taking too much? So I take 2 when I really need 3. And what's happening here is not just private embarrassment. And that's sort of what I want us to see here. It's experienced privately and individually, but it's political discipline. It's a political form of shaming. These stigmatizing discourses make her feel like a criminal for taking what she needs. And there's 40 million people who are feeling that way. It's no longer private, right? It's not a private problem. So the genuine work of charity is undermined by these discourses and once again make the world safer for capitalism and less safe for everyday people like me and you. The Black Panther Party understood this dynamic with striking clarity. Their survival programs were not acts of charity, they were acts of political education and collective self-determination. They saw food justice as a site for collective resistance. Their survival programs were designed to build critical consciousness and coalitions among disparate groups. And they adamantly refused the common sense narratives around charity, instead calling them survival programs and people's programs. This is why Insight's core reminder is this. The existence of nonprofits is not the same as the existence of liberation. Even nonprofits have to work hard towards liberation. It is not enough that we give out food, we also have to work to build critical consciousness and coalitions. And they also say, most hopefully for us, that we do not have to burn the nonprofit industrial complex down as we should the military industrial complex and the prison industrial complex. And this is because there's much to be saved in the NPIC. They write about the radical consciousness and community and real joy and love that exist in nonprofits. And this is why I began my talk with Meyer's words. She embodies not only kindness and empathy, but also a radical political consciousness shaped by witnessing lives like those of her parents. All right, so what do we do? How do we intervene in this interlocking system? I outlined these three interlocking forces that undermine genuine care: the NPIC, neoliberalism, and communicative discourses that sustain them. As frontline workers, you have a front row seat to the revenge politics as it plays out in everyday practice. You see it every day. And these forces can make the work feel very constraining and at times even hopeless. But we're not being asked to quit our jobs or to collapse into cynicism, defensiveness, guilt, or hopelessness. In fact, far from it. We are being asked to think seriously about how systems contain our dissent and how we can build power anyway. How can we resist revenge neoliberalism? What can we do, produce, and say beyond neoliberal capitalism? We are being asked to think expansively and collectively grow our moral and political imagination. And so there are these four practical shifts, or starting points, that I've seen food pantries and banks engage with, which are all about building the radical imagination. And I'm just going to talk about these four real briefly. The first one is change the story you tell about hunger. Don't frame hunger as scarcity or poor choices. Like the Black Panther Party, frame it as policy violence. Wages, rent, healthcare, racism, gendered violence. Name the true root causes of hunger. Make your communication do political education, not just fundraising. The second point I have is about building rights talk into everyday operation. Even if you can't say something like abolish poverty in a grant report, you can still embed a rights-based frame in your everyday work. This means treating client dignity as non-negotiable, avoiding moralizing language, avoiding judgments about people's behaviors and choices, eliminating punitive hoops, and never using the loaded term charity. Reframe them as the people's programs, the people's survival programs. Number three, stop letting non-partisan mean non-political. Yeah. Nonpartisan does not mean silent. It means you don't endorse candidates. But you absolutely can, and you must, name the conditions producing hunger. Talk about HR1 as revenge politics and revenge neoliberalism, and advocate for policies that are safe for people and not safe for capitalism. And my last point here is to invest in power-building relationships and coalitions and partnerships so that food becomes a doorway or a gateway into solidarity, an entry point for cultivating a collective radical imagination, because we have to do this work collectively. It cannot be individual. We have to build a collective radical imagination for the public good. And again, I want to reiterate, these shifts do not require you to quit your job or surrender or despair. In fact, I've been really disheartened when people in the current administration keep quitting, like the people you want them to stay there, and they quit. No, this is the time we stay, we resist, and we do not quit or surrender to despair. We have to keep hope alive. And as frontline workers, this moment calls on you to name what you see, to observe, be constitutional observers, to document, to record, to act as a buffer when you can, to chip away at revenge in small and steady ways, because even the small things matter today, to push back and to blow your whistles. We must interrupt and disrupt revenge whenever it appears, and say wholeheartedly that these are the people's survival programs and revenge has no place here.